Okay, so I wanted to talk about jhana while my mind is in jhana. You just never know how long it'll last, so I figured the best time to talk about it is while I'm experiencing it. And so the way that the Buddha describes the first jhana is um, is the absence of five factors and the presence of another five factors. So the five factors that are absent are the five hindrances or the five obstacles. You can call them the five distractions. And these are the things that make the mind scattered and fragmented and distracted and spread out. So to begin with, jhana is the definition of samadhi. When the Buddha talks about the eighth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, he calls it sama samadhi. And he defines it as first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, and then sometimes he gets into the ayatanas that branch off of the fourth jhana, and even in other texts he gets into the sightless concentration of mind, as well as nirodha samapatti, which is the attainment of nirodha, sometimes nirodha or cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness. But the jhana is how the Buddha defines samadhi. So in order to understand jhana, you first have to understand what the word samadhi means. And samadhi basically means gathered together or unified. You know from your own experience that the mind is typically disunified, disjointed, not gathered together. The energies of the mind are scattered all over the place. They're off in the past, in the future. They're creating a fictional present. They are doing multiple things at once. You have multiple samsaras, multiple narratives, multiple realities being constructed and lived simultaneously. And whichever dominates is what's guiding your behavior and creating your suffering. So that's the state of the mind when it's not in jhana, which is the sort of what we've unfortunately become used to and accepted as what we are and what we have. And so what are the five hindrances? So samadhi, first of all, is gathering together. So when the mind gathers together, it gets rid of what's called the five hindrances, the five nivarana. So don't mistake that word for nirvana, because nirvana is complete liberation. It's the extinction of greed, hatred, and delusion, or extinguishing of greed, hatred, and delusion. And the nivarana are basically not that. So the nivarana are the five hindrances, the obstacles to jhana, the obstacles to meditation. And when the mind gathers and becomes samadhi, it enters into the first jhana, or it becomes jhana, by abandoning the five hindrances, first of all. So the first of the five hindrances is called kama chanda in Pali, which is sensual lust. It is the wanting of sensual experiences, whether that be watching TV, having sex, having a conversation, any kind of stimulating experience, any kind of thing that stimulates the senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, or the brain, the intellect. So it's that seeking of stimulation. That's what kamachanda is. The second is vyapada, which is ill will or negativity. It's a disgruntled mind. It's kind of icky, sticky, gross mind. The mind that gossips, the mind that complains, the mind that criticizes, the mind that is in a bad mood, you can call it. The third hindrance is tina mida, sloth and torpor, or just think of it as drowsiness, sleepiness, laziness. If you sit down for meditation, you're nodding off, or you're spacey and dreamy, you're experiencing tina mida. And then the fourth hindrance is udaka kacha. I'm forgetting the Pali, but essentially it's restlessness and remorse. It's the wandering mind, the mind that is constantly trying to get somewhere, doesn't want to sit still, and or it's regretting something from the past, it's longing for the future. It just is a mind that won't stay where it won't stay with the object of meditation. It won't stay with the experience. You don't actually have to have an object. It's just a matter of, will the mind stay here or will it not? The restless and remorseful mind will not stay where it's supposed to be, where you want it to be, where you're directing it. And then lastly is vicikiccha, which is translated often as skeptical doubt, but I think of it as indecision or the oscillation of mind. Bhante Punjabi also defines vicikiccha as mental oscillation. It's the inability to choose the cereal or the dog food at the market. You're looking at every single box and you can't decide on which one, or you're sitting down for meditation and you can't settle on an object or commit to the practice because the mind is just indecisive, it's shaky, it's going back and forth. So when those 5 nivarana, those 5 hindrances are not present, the mind experiences the 5 jhana factors. First of all, in order to get rid of those 5 hindrances, the mind has to be able to vitaka and vichara, which is applied and sustained attention. So when you sit down and you open a book and read it, and you're able to actually go from line by line without losing your focus, you're practicing vitaka and vichara in that moment. When you sit down and you're able to stay with the breath or with the loving kindness or whatever the object of meditation is, that's vitaka, vichara. It's sustained, applied and sustained, focused attention. And when you're able to just experience the world you're in, the moment you're in, continuously without the mind jumping around in the universe and being scattered, that's vitaka, vichara. So when the mind falls into a flow state, it's experiencing vitaka, vichara, and that's why the hindrances will fall away. And it's the falling away of the hindrances that causes so the vitaka, vichara, the first 2 jhana factors. The 5 factors that you're getting rid of are those 5 hindrances I just explained. And then the first 2 factors that are present, the jhana factors, the first 2, vitaka, vichara, that's that flow state of applied and sustained attention. And then the next 2 factors come as a result of those 5 hindrances going away. And because we're so used to feeling icky from those 5 hindrances, when they go away, we experience piti, which is rapture, and then we experience sukha, which is bliss. So rapture and bliss, or piti and sukha, first of all, piti is an excited, rapturous, joyful, shake kind of feeling. There's just so much joy that comes from the relief of the hindrances going away and the mind becoming clear and still and focused, that you just experience a joy. And you also experience a feeling of accomplishment because you've been trying to do this. And even if you haven't been trying, just the relief of the hindrances go away causes this joy. Sukha is when the joy settles down into more of a peaceful kind of happiness, blissful happiness, or a stable happiness. So the PT naturally dissolves into bliss, or the PT naturally dissolves into sukha. You could think of sukha as comfort, as well-being, PT as excited happiness. Just as long as you know that PT is much more energetic state of happiness, and sukha is a much more calm, stable state of happiness. And then lastly, the mind is ekaggata. That's the last jhana factor, which is unification of mind. That's when the mind has gathered together all of its energies. And for me, it almost feels like the force of gravity has gathered around me, because the mind has so much power to it that when it gathers together, it honestly feels like you can move objects. You can't, as far as I know, but it feels like you can, because there's just so much power to the mind when it's unified. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing. So when those 5 hindrances are not present and those 5 jhana factors are present, then you're in the first jhana. And that's why I'm telling you right now, just being honest, that my mind is in first jhana. And every time I've had profound awakening experiences, my mind has been in a state of jhana for long periods of time afterwards. And it's just a state where you don't have those nasty hindrances, and because they're gone, you're able to be focused, you're able to be happy, you're able to have the mind's energies all gathered together. So the first jhana is a functional state. It is a really, really, really nice state of awakening, temporary awakening, you could say. full complete awakening, or what the Buddha calls liberation, doesn't happen until greed, hatred, and delusion are completely destroyed, because as long as they're still there, they're going to recreate all of those hindrances, the fetters, and all of that stuff that I'm not going to go into in this video. But if the mind is clear of hindrances and those jhana factors are present, then you're in first jhana. No matter how much people tell you that jhana is whatever it says in the Visuddhimagga, or whatever complicated set of criteria that you've heard, it's more like what's being described there is more like a state, a self-hypnotic trance state. And if you remember the Buddha's recollection of his experience of first jhana, he was a child, 7 years old, under the rose apple tree watching a festival, and he fell into a state of clear bliss, and that recollection broke him of this illusion that he had to find some special deep trance state, or to whip himself to death, or starve himself to death. And he sat in that first jhana, and then he went through the rest of the jhanas, saw dependent origination and all that stuff, and attained full awakening and liberation in that night, in the 3 watches of the night on his awakening. So that first jhana is the gateway, and it is a functional, clear state of mind that you can be in all the time if you understand what creates it, what maintains it, and what hinders it. So just want to pause for a second and make sure that if you're watching this, that you understand that first jhana is not an impossible attainment, and that first jhana is a state of mind that you need in order to progress towards liberation. In the Majjhima Nikaya number 64 sutta, if you go and look at that sutta, it's a very, very interesting and elaborate sutta, but what I get from that, and that I always come back to, is that the Buddha reveals in that sutta and many others that first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, the ayatanas and everything, in any of those states of absorption, of bliss, you can attain full awakening from that if you can take the mind and attend to nibbana, the deathless element. And what is that deathless element? It is the element of extinguishing. It is the natural aspect of ultimate reality that dissolves delusion. So in the case that the example I've used before of turning on the light when you're a child because you think you see a monster in the corner, and as soon as the light turns on, the monster disappears, that light turning on is the nibbana dhatu, the deathless element, the extinguishing element in that scenario. And I've also used the example of a moment of clarity for an alcoholic. It's the nibbana dhatu that extinguishes the delusion in that moment, and the greed and that hatred in that moment, that allows that alcoholic to see clearly and to move on to the path of sobriety. So the nibbana dhatu is ever present. This is something that Buddhadasa talked about, because the nibbana dhatu is a quality of ultimate reality. When the mind sees the unconditioned, the ultimate reality, whatever delusion, hatred, or greed is present in the mind at that moment will be extinguished. It doesn't mean it's going to be extinguished and uprooted completely, never to re-arise again, but in that moment it will be extinguished and the mind will clarify. And every time the mind encounters ultimate reality, it enters a new level of understanding, and it's the responsibility of the seeker to integrate that new level of understanding into the experiences that follow. So first jhana is technically all you need to keep practicing, to live a happy life, to progress towards liberation, keep the mind free of hindrances, keep the mind clear, focused, in a flow state, a state of non-resistance, a state of non-desiring, right? Because resistance is that vyapada, that ill will, and desire is that kama chanda, that lust, that sensual lust. And then so those first 2 hindrances come from greed and hatred. Everything stems from those unwholesome roots. And then the next 3 hindrances come from delusion. So drowsiness, restlessness, and doubt. they all stem from delusion. So ultimately it all comes down to these unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. And a jhana is a temporary cessation of those unwholesome roots. So it's a glimpse of nibbana as well. And so I think that take that to heart, that first jhana is a functional state. Why is it functional? Because you still have vitakka, vichara, that's applied and sustained thought. You can think and speak and function in first jhana. Your mind is clear. If jhana wasn't a functional state of mind, it would be pretty freaking useless. If the only way that you could experience awakening is sitting down on a cushion with your eyes closed and absorbed into an object, then awakening would be a useless thing, especially if you're not a yogi in a cave in the Himalayas. So take this to heart, that jhana is something you could walk around in and be extremely happy and blissed out all the time, with a mind empty of hindrances and clear and focused. So I repeated that a few times because I just want to make sure that if you're watching this, that you understand that first jhana is something that you can attain and maintain, and that it's not inaccessible, and that it is the path to awakening, or the path to liberation. It, goes through first jhana, the realization of ultimate reality. So let me talk about the next several jhanas now and explain why they could be important, why you may need them. If you have very stubborn illusions, you may need the rest of the jhanas and the ayatanas and the nirodha samapatti and all that stuff to get awakened or to get liberated completely. So essentially each jhana is a letting go, a shedding of a previous layer of disturbance. So the first jhana, you're shedding all of the static of the mind, the hindrances, all of the useless activity that the mind does, jumping around in time and place and being angry and lustful and all that stuff that I mentioned when I talked about the nirvana. So you're shedding that activity and the mind becomes clear and focused and in a state of flow. It's experiencing ultimate reality in the first jhana, and it's filled with bliss and rapture because of that. But that stuff can be distracting. The vitakka and the vichara, the clear thinking, the clear applied and sustained thought, the ability to form words and concepts, essentially, is what vitakka and vichara is. You're still able to form concepts. That can be a distraction, as well as the piti and the sukha. So every jhana that follows the first is a shedding away of one of those layers, one of those factors. So when you get into the second jhana, the mind becomes silent because vitakka and vichara are shed away. So you're no longer thinking verbally. You no longer have discursive thought in the second jhana. You still have piti and sukha. You still have ekaggata, the unification of mind, but you don't have vitakka and vichara in the second jhana. So the mind becomes very quiet. You enter noble silence in the second jhana. It's an internal silence, and that's pretty wonderful, actually. In fact, when you're in the first jhana, like before I made this video, it's really easy to just let the mind sink into silence because you're not really grasping if you're doing it right. But if I'm talking to a person, then I have to use conceptual thought, so you can only do that in the first jhana. But you can walk around in the second jhana. I've done it. And so you can walk around with a mind that is in the state of flow and not conceptualizing until a person comes and talks to you, and then you kind of have to muster up the thinking in order to be able to respond. But you can walk around with a silent, clear mind, and this is also a really wonderful state and to be in. When I was living in Thailand after Swanmukh, I was driving my motorbike in the second jhana, and it felt great. I felt like I barely had a body. I felt like I was floating through space, timeless, blissful space. It was amazing. And then when you get into third jhana, the piti starts to shed away. So you get into a more stable happiness, and the mind begins to prefer that because it recognizes the instability of the piti. And then when you get into the fourth jhana, the fourth jhana is the one you really can't carry around with you walking, because you lose the experience of body in the fourth jhana. You really just have mind, and at least in the experience of it, I kind of hesitate to say that, because the four jhanas are called the rupa jhanas, so you still have the experience of form in the rupa jhanas. So if I'm being textually adherent, then I would say no, but I hadn't, sometimes when I get deep into the jhanas, there is a point where I feel like I can stand up, walk around, go to the bathroom, cook my food, take a shower, and the body feels sort of like a cloud of sensation rather than a defined form. And there's no thought, and there's just space and silence and stillness. And for me personally, I consider that to be the fourth jhana, because it's quiet, it's still, and the experience of form is very, very vague. People who see you in that state think that you're basically like took way too much edibles because you're just kind of smiling and giggling and barely there, in a way. Not barely there, but like your experience of body is very, very faint. So this is also pretty wonderful. You can't go to work in that state. I used to teach English in Thailand, and I would get up, sit down, go into the jhanas, get up, go get some joke at the joke guy. Joke is like a rice porridge, and still in jhana, just smiling and giggling, blissing out. And then I would get onto my motorbike with my wife. She'd get behind me, and I would stay in that jhana. And then I'd walk into the classroom, stand in front of this room full of third graders, and they'd all be looking at me, and I'd just be smiling. And then I would just sort of like have to reactivate that conceptual thought in that moment and go into this character of Michael and perform my class that I had planned. It was just a joyful play. But anyway, I'm trying to find a balance in these videos between sticking to the text and then letting my experience be instructive as well. So, call that what it is. But you're shedding away layers of activity, you can say. So when you get into the fourth jhana, the experience of the body pretty much vanishes, and there's no thought. It's complete silence, and even the piti and sukha go away. That's the point I want to get at here. You experience, instead of piti and sukha, you as a dwelling, you experience upekkha, which is usually translated as equanimity. And you experience upekkha because your only jhana factor left really is that ekaggata, which is that unification of mind. And when the mind is completely unified in this state, it has the Brahma Vihara of upekkha as its chitta, as its knowing, I guess you could say, as it's sort of its emotional state. Didn't want to use that word, but that's kind of, I guess, the best description I can do. You have upekkha, and upekkha is translated usually as equanimity, but I like to think of it as composure. And I even like better the way Bhante Punyaji translates upekkha. He translates it as apperception. So he says that sati, or satipatthana, is looking within. We cease seeing the sensory realm as we start to recognize that they're not out there, they're actually in here, right? They're internal representations. That's what ayatana means. They're internal representations of what the senses are gathering. Think of it scientifically. The visual field is actually in the visual cortex. The auditory field is in the auditory cortex, and so on and so forth. So the external world is not really out there, it's in here. So we start by looking within, and then he says that satipatthana is looking within, and then upekkha is seeing within. So that's when the ayatanas, the internal representations of external data becomes completely clear and vivid. And that experience is called upekkha because there's just a complete feeling of balance and stillness, and you don't have so much of an emotional joy, but I would still call it a true happiness because it's a happiness of absence. It's an emptiness. It's a level of emptiness. And from that state in the fourth jhana, you can then shed even more layers, which then goes into what's usually called the arupa jhanas, but the Buddha calls them the ayatanas, the bases. So the first base is the base of infinite space. And the reason that it feels like this is when the body disappears, in my experience. So this first arupa jhana, you cannot walk around in this at all. You have no body. It feels like a VR helmet has been lifted away, and it feels like there's just an awareness without any objects in it. It just feels like a void. When I get into this state, I actually hear the opening sounds of Pink Floyd's is it the Welcome to, it's on the Wish You're Here album. I think it's Welcome to the Machine. So if you listen to Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd, that opening sort of composure, that music that you hear, that's kind of what it's, that's the sound, that's the sign of the first arupa jhana that my mind produces. It's like a heavenly sound. But it's called infinite space because the experience of body goes away. So time and space are dimensions of perception, right? So space is length, width, and breadth, or height, width, and breadth, the 3 dimensions of space, and then the 1 dimension of time. So when you're experiencing infinite space, the dimension of space has vanished, and so there's no perception of space. It feels like the boundaries between self and world have vanished because self and world have ceased, and it feels like boundless space. What follows that is the base of infinite consciousness, and it's called the base of infinite consciousness for me. I'll just say in my own experience, because I know the textual definitions, but the way that I experience the base of infinite consciousness is you begin to notice that consciousness is not only the perceptual activity of the brain, but it's an element of nature. Everything in nature has consciousness. Consciousness is not personal. It is not a self. It's not an identity. It's not a thing. It is an element of nature that is ever present. It is in inanimate objects as well as animate objects. It is just knowing. The reason that our consciousness can arise from matter is because consciousness is also an element of nature. The Buddha calls it the vijnana dhatu. There's a level of the Buddha's teaching where he calls everything dhatus, and Buddhadasa talks about this, the teaching of everything as elements or everything as properties. So you begin to perceive that consciousness is not something personal to you. It's not you, it's not yours. It is impersonal. It is everywhere all the time. And yes, it arises in this body-mind as perception, which is what the particular vijnanas of this body-mind are. Mano vijnana, citta vijnana, Chaku vijnana, eye consciousness. Mano vijnana is intellectual consciousness. Citta vijnana is the emotional consciousness. And then there's ear consciousness, tongue consciousness. So these are particular iterations of consciousness. And the Buddha compares this to a fire. So the same way that fire is a property of nature and it arises dependent on the conditions for fire to arise, so fuel, oxygen, and heat, when they come together under the right atmospheric pressure, fire arises. And then a fire is designated by the particular conditions. So a fire dependent on sticks is a stick fire, for a fire dependent on the forest is a forest fire, and so on and so forth. But fire itself is a property of nature. So in the realm of infinite consciousness, you see clearly that consciousness is completely impersonal. It's arising and passing away in this body mind as well as everywhere else in nature. It's across the universe, just like the Beatles song. And if you take this state personally, then you think that you're God, and you think that there's this pervasive, all-knowing consciousness. But if you understand it a little more clearly than that, then what you do is you break your identification with the consciousness element. You realize that this is not the thing to identify with. So space and consciousness then both cease. And it's like climbing a ladder when you're going through the jhanas. You abandon the previous rung for the next one, or going down, let's say you're going down steps. You have to abandon the previous step in order to attain to the next step. So each factor sheds away as you're going into the jhana, and really it's mental activity that's ceasing, brain activity that's ceasing as you're going deeper into the jhanas and the ayatanas or the arupa jhanas. So after this base of infinite consciousness, where you see that consciousness is impersonal, it's everywhere, and not only that, it is arising and passing incessantly, and you have no control over that arising passing, it's guided by the law of nature, then you see that this consciousness is not me, it's not mine, it's not who I am, it's not something that I should identify with, and you let it go. And that's a deep letting go. And then you experience the non-arising of consciousness, which is the base of nothingness. It's the gaps between the arising of consciousness, and you see that between the passing away and the arising of consciousness is the non-arising of consciousness, which is the base of nothingness. And that is not something that's necessarily easy to describe. And I would say it's almost like a mute. It's almost like someone hit the mute button on experience. But since the hindrances aren't present, you don't long for the consciousness. You kind of, it's just like there's like, it's like, I guess the best way I can describe it is like the mute button was hit. And then the cessation of perception, or sorry, the experience of perception or neither perception or non-perception, that one I honestly can't describe because I don't know that I've experienced it. And it doesn't even appear in all of the texts, so I'm not even sure if it's something that's necessary to experience. But what possibly that could be in terms of my own experience is that consciousness is an element of nature, but perception is the particular quality of consciousness in human experience. So perception is dependent on the brain and the nervous system. Perception is what sensation is made into, and then so the brain has the process of sensation, perception, and cognition. So sensation is just sensory consciousness. Perception is the labeling and the knowing and the identification of that as this or that. It's the recognition. It's dependent on memory. So memory and perception are psychological factors that depend on one another. And then cognition is thinking. So these are particular to the brain. So in the state of neither perception nor non-perception, I guess I'll just go ahead and give you my theory on this. But when I got into my deepest state of meditation, which happens occasionally, there's a state where you experience awareness, but you don't experience perception. You're completely aware, but there's no sensory experience. So that's why it's difficult to describe. So my guess is that must be what the Buddha is talking about when he talks about neither perception or non-perception. But I also wonder if that's the silence concentration of mind. So understanding exactly what these terms mean is difficult, but I can tell you that there is a state of meditation when there's simply awareness without any sense data. There's no process of perception happening. But there is awareness there, and it's the most relaxing, most relieving thing you can imagine. And then Nirota Samapati is when everything just goes blank. And the first time I experienced that was back at Swan Muk. After I came out of meditation, I went and I sat on my concrete slab that they called a bed. And before I could lay my head down, my body kind of sat itself up back into the meditation posture, and I sunk back into the jhana, and then all of a sudden everything just stopped. And then the next thing I remember is hearing the bell at 4 in the morning. So there was like a 6 or 7 hour gap in time and space and consciousness where there was just a not there-ness, I guess you can say. But the next day when I came out of that, that's when I started having these major insights that I've talked about, seeing a continuous arising and passing away, seeing that the mind simply appears and disappears at every moment of sensory contact, seeing that reality is constructed by narrative. The day after this cessation, I started to see that everything that is conditioned in contrast to the ultimate reality of the unconditioned. And I threw away that conditioned reality for a long time after that. So essentially, these jhanas are a shutting down of the mental processes and then bringing them back up again in order to see that the entire world with which we identify, that we cling to, that we base our happiness in, is all just conditioned. And I've used the word false, I've used the word fiction, I've used the word illusion, but more accurately, it's constructed and it's conditioned. And a house is a constructed condition. This body is a constructed condition. So just because something is constructed and conditioned doesn't mean that it is actually false. False is sort of just a way of letting it go by saying that. But it's not Satchitananda. It's not transcendent consciousness. It's not permanent bliss. It's not ultimate reality, right? The world of conditions is the world of arising and passing, and if we base our happiness in the world of arising and passing, then our happiness is dependent, and dependent happiness is not happiness, it's pleasure. And dependent love is not love, it's conditional. And relative truth is not ultimate truth. And that is what going through these jhanas teaches the mind, that the world of conditions is not the ultimate reality, and therefore should not be sought after, should not be clung to, should not be relished, should be, I guess you can say, cherished in the way that we cherish anything that's temporary. You hold it with a nurturing mind, you cherish it. As William Blake says, you kiss the joy as it flies. I might be misquoting that, but he says something like that. And if your illusions are very stubborn, then you need to go through this entire process to disillusion the mind. If you're able to let go, if you're more of a faith mind type person, then from the first jhana, you can see the ultimate reality and let go of all of your illusions and just be happy. All right, I'm not going to say any more about jhana today, except to remind you that it is easily achievable when the mind is clear of its hindrances, and you attend towards the ultimate reality, nibbana, the deathless. That's how you dispel delusion and greed and hatred from the first jhana. So go ahead and leave any disagreements or comments you have, and I will respond in the comment section, or I'll make another video response. And if you're getting benefit from this content, you're enjoying these videos, then go ahead and subscribe, share with your friends, and thank you for watching.